All right, listeners, buckle up for a deep dive that's going to be, well, a little intense, but I promise it's super interesting. We're going deep into the U.S. Army's Field Manual on Internment and Resettlement Operations.
Oh yeah, this one is definitely not your light beach read,
Uh-huh.
but
Kidding.
it's really eye-opening stuff.
For sure, and it's from 2010, right?
Yep, 2010. And it basically lays out how the military is supposed to handle different groups of people, in all sorts of situations. I mean, think about it. Prisoner of war camps,
Hmm.
helping civilians after a hurricane, all kinds of stuff.
So, like, a real mix of people, situations, locations. That's got to be tricky.
Yeah, you said it. And that's where this manual comes in, trying to provide some guidance for navigating all these different scenarios.
Makes sense. So, where do we even begin with something like this? I mean, what's the starting point?
Well, one of the first things that jumps out is how specific this manual is about the categories of people it covers. And get ready for a lot of acronyms.
Oh, great. Love those. Military loves their acronyms.
Oh, you're telling me. But it's helpful, I guess, to keep everything organized when you're dealing with so many different moving parts.
All right, so let's break it down. What are these different categories of people we're talking about here?
Okay, so first up, you've got your enemy prisoners of war, or EPWs.
EPWs. Yeah.
Basically, captured enemy combatants.
Okay, that one makes sense. Pretty much what you picture when you think of a POW camp, right?
Exactly. But then it gets, well, more nuanced.
Oh.
You also have civilian internees, or CIs. These are civilians who are detained for security reasons.
So not enemy combatants, but still considered a potential risk.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where things start to get a bit ethically complicated.
I can imagine. Like, who gets to decide who's a security risk and on what grounds? Lots of room for debate there.
Yeah, definitely raises some serious questions. And then you have retained personnel, or RPs.
RPs, okay. Who are they?
These are folks like medical personnel, chaplains, people who are protected under the Geneva Conventions.
So even in the middle of a conflict, there's recognition that some people have to be treated differently based on their roles.
Absolutely. And then there are the dislocated civilians, or DCs. These are civilians who have been forced from their homes by, well, all sorts of things. Conflict, natural disaster, you name it. They might need assistance, maybe even resettlement.
So from POWs to civilians caught in the crossfire, it's a pretty broad spectrum of people this manual covers.
Yeah. And it doesn't stop there. It even has a whole section on managing U.S. military prisoners, service members who have violated military law.
Wow. So this thing really does cover all the bases. It's like a comprehensive look at how the military handles detention and resettlement across a whole range of circumstances.
Pretty much. And
All right.
with all these different people and situations, I mean, things can get pretty chaotic, even dangerous, right?
No doubt. So what does the manual say about ensuring humane treatment for all these groups? Does it even address that?
Oh yeah, definitely. And one thing that really stands out is this constant emphasis on humane treatment for everyone, regardless of their status.
That's good to hear. But, I mean, what does that actually look like? What kind of specifics does the manual lay out?
Well, it gets pretty specific, actually.
Like what?
For example, it mandates providing adequate food, water, shelter, medical care. Everyone has the right to practice their religion freely. And it specifically prohibits cruel or degrading treatment.
Interesting. So it goes beyond just the basics, like food and shelter, and addresses things like religious freedom. Seems like they're acknowledging the need to respect individual rights, even in these really difficult situations.
Yeah, that's a good point. They don't just stop at the bare minimum. The manual even lays out the right to legal counsel and the opportunity to appeal your detention, if there are questions about its legitimacy.
So like a framework for due process, even in these kinds of settings.
Right. And to make sure things are running smoothly, they also bring in international organizations like the International Committee of the Red Cross to monitor conditions.
Okay, so they're trying to cover all the bases when it comes to safeguarding those core principles of humane treatment. That's
Yeah. But it's important to remember that this is a military manual, right?
right.
So security and control, those are paramount too. It's not all sunshine and roses.
Evening, yeah.
Well, the manual gets into the nitty-gritty of how to maintain order in these facilities.
Oh, I bet that gets pretty intense.
It can. And sometimes it feels a little, well, jarring when you contrast it with all the talk about humane treatment.
Okay, so let's dive into that side of things. What kind of procedures are we talking about here?
Well, for starters, they have different types of facilities.
Yeah.
You've got your temporary holding areas, like dislocated civilian processing centers. Those are DCPs for short. And then, dislocated civilian holding areas, or DHAs.
Wow, more acronyms. DCPs, DHAs. I swear,
Yeah.
this whole manual is like one giant alphabet soup.
Yeah, it can be a bit overwhelming for sure. But I guess it makes sense when you think about it. I mean, they're dealing with so many different types of people, situations. They need a way to keep it all straight.
True, true. So you've got these temporary spots. What happens after that? Where do people go from there?
Well, it can kind of escalate depending on the situation. You can go from those temporary holding areas to more permanent facilities,
Yeah.
like theater internment facilities. Those are TIFs.
Tiff's got it. And those are what, like longer term detention?
Yeah, exactly. And then there are the really long-term ones, strategic internment facilities, SIFs.
Fifth. Okay, so it's like a whole system, different levels depending on the situation. And I'm guessing there are a ton of procedures for, managing all these different people in all these different places.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The manual goes into a lot of detail about like intake procedures, how they process individuals when they first arrive at a facility. There are instructions for everything, cell searches, garb rotations, even the types of restraints they're allowed to use.
Restraints. Wait, really? That sounds pretty intense.
Yeah, it's definitely not something you want to think about too much, but there are specific guidelines for restraining techniques, the types of restraints that are permitted. It's all designed to minimize the risk of harm while still, well, maintaining control.
Yeah, I can see how that would be a tough balance to strike. You want to keep everyone safe, but you also don't want to be, overly harsh or cause unnecessary suffering.
Exactly. And that's why training is so important for the military personnel working in these facilities. They have to make really difficult judgment calls in, stressful situations. The manual really stresses the need for them to act professionally and with restraint.
I bet. It makes you wonder about the psychological impact of this kind of work, both
Mm.
for the people being detained and for the people doing the detaining.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And it's something the manual acknowledges, at least to some extent. They talk about the need for like mental health support for the personnel working in these facilities. I mean, the potential for stress and burnout is huge.
For sure. You're dealing with people who might be hostile. You're in a high pressure environment. There's always the possibility of violence. It's got to take a toll.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just about, the mental health of the personnel. The manual also talks about the importance of monitoring the physical and mental health of the detainees too.
What's the reasoning behind that?
Well, I mean, for one thing, it's just basic human decency, right? But it also ties back into that whole emphasis on humane treatment.
Mm.
Regular medical checkups can help, identify any signs of mistreatment or abuse. It's another layer of accountability, a way to make sure those guidelines are being followed.
Because even with the best intentions, things can still go wrong, right?
Absolutely. And that's something we can't forget.
Right. Okay, so we've got different types of facilities, the procedures for managing detainees, the potential for things to go wrong. What else does this manual cover? Is there more?
Well, one thing that might surprise you is the emphasis on communication. They really stress the importance of making sure that people understand what's happening, even in these, chaotic and stressful situations.
Really?
Yeah.
I wouldn't have expected that to be a priority in a military manual about, internment.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting, actually. They talk about the need for, like, qualified interpreters, making sure that detainees have access to information in their own language. They even provide them with a written order of internment that explains, their rights and the reasons for their detention, all in their own language.
Wow, they're really trying to be transparent.
It seems that way, and it makes sense when you think about it. I mean, if you're going to detain someone, the least you can do is explain why, make sure they understand what's going on, what their rights are.
That's a good point. It's about basic respect, even when someone's freedom is being restricted. Hadn't thought about it that way before.
And this emphasis on communication extends to other aspects of the operation too, even something as inherently tricky as interrogations.
Okay, so now we're talking about gathering intelligence from those who are being detained. That's got to be a really sensitive area, to say the least. What kind of guidance does the manual offer on that?
Well, the manual is very clear that interrogations have to be conducted, in accordance with all applicable laws and regulations. There's a zero tolerance policy for coercion or torture. Those are totally off limits.
That's good to hear. But even with those rules in place, I mean, how do you actually make sure those lines aren't crossed?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, right? The manual does outline procedures for, reporting and investigating any allegations of mistreatment. But ultimately, it comes down to the individuals involved, their training, their professionalism, their commitment to upholding those standards.
So it's not just about having rules on paper. It's about creating a culture of accountability and respect.
Exactly. And that's not something you can just, create overnight. It takes time, it takes effort, it takes strong leadership and a real commitment to those core values. It's an ongoing process.
As we've been talking about all this, it's really struck me that this manual, while obviously focused on the military, also highlights the role of civilian agencies, especially when it comes to resettlement.
Oh, yeah, definitely. That's a really important point. And it's something that's often overlooked.
How so?
Well, resettlement isn't just about, providing for people's immediate needs like food and shelter. It's about helping them rebuild their lives. And that requires a whole network, a collaboration between the military and all sorts of civilian organizations.
So how does that work? What does that collaboration look like? Does the manual get into that?
Yeah, it does. It emphasizes the need for coordination with NGOs, humanitarian aid groups, even local communities. They talk about things like vocational training, educational programs, even microloans to help people, get back on their feet economically.
Well, so it's really thinking long term,
Mhm.
not just meeting those immediate needs, but actually empowering people to regain their independence and, build a new life.
Exactly. And it highlights the fact that resettlement is a process. It's not just something you check off a list and move on. It takes time, it takes ongoing support, and a real commitment to helping people reintegrate into society.
I have to admit it, going into this deep dive, I had a pretty simplistic view of, internment and resettlement.
Mm.
I pictured like barbed wire fences and guard towers. But this manual has really opened my eyes to the complexities involved, the sheer scope of the operation, and the fact that they are making efforts to ensure humane treatment, even in these, really difficult circumstances.
Right. Yeah, I think that's one of the most valuable things about this deep dive. It challenges our assumptions, forces us to think critically about these issues. It's easy to make judgments from a distance, but when you really get into the details, you realize there's a lot more to it than meets the eye.
Absolutely. And that's especially important today with all the news about conflict, displacement, humanitarian crises. This manual gives us a framework for understanding these situations, for asking the right questions, and for holding those in power accountable.
Exactly. It's a reminder that even in the middle of all this chaos and uncertainty, there are rules, there are standards, and there are people working to uphold those principles, even when it's tough. That's something we shouldn't forget.
I agree. So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, is there a final thought you want to leave our listeners with, something they can, mull over as they continue to explore this topic?
Let me see. I think it all comes back to that question we keep coming back to, the tension between security and humane treatment. As you learn more about these issues, as you read stories about people who have been affected by internment and resettlement, keep asking yourself, how can we as a society navigate that tension? How can we make sure that our actions, both here at home and on the global stage, reflect our commitment to both security and compassion? How can we hold ourselves and our leaders accountable for upholding those values, even in the toughest situations?
Those are some heavy questions, ones that I know I'll be thinking about long after this deep dive is over. Thanks for guiding us through this. It's been eye-opening, to say the least.
It's been my pleasure. And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this journey. Keep asking those tough questions, keep learning, and keep pushing for a world where security and humanity can actually coexist. It's a tough goal, but it's one worth striving for.
It's a tough one, no doubt. And I think, the manual itself kind of reflects that struggle. Like on the one hand, you've got all these procedures, protocols, all about maintaining order, control. But then on the other hand, there's this constant emphasis on treating people with dignity, respect, even when they're, being deprived of their freedom.
It's like these two ideas are always pushing against each other.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is, there's no easy answer, right? It's not just about choosing one over the other.
Right.
You have to find a way to navigate that tension, make decisions that prioritize both security and humanity, even when those things seem to be, well, in conflict.
And that's going to be incredibly difficult, especially in these high pressure situations when the stakes are so high. Oh, absolutely. And the manual acknowledges that. It doesn't shy away from the fact that things can go wrong. It talks about the risks of abuse, the psychological impact of confinement, the possibility of cultural misunderstandings that can lead to conflict. It's a pretty realistic picture of the challenges that come with this kind of work.
Going into this deep dive, I have to admit, I had a pretty, well, simplistic view of internment and resettlement. Like all I could picture were barbed wire fences and guard towers. But this manual has really opened my eyes to, like, the complexities, the sheer scope of the operation, and the fact that they are making a real effort to ensure humane treatment, even in these, well, really difficult circumstances.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most important things to take away from this. It challenges our assumptions, makes us think critically about these issues. It's easy to judge from the outside, but when you really dig into the details, you realize it's a lot more complicated than it seems.
It is, and that's so important, especially today when we're constantly hearing about conflict, displacement, humanitarian crises all over the world.
Mm.
This manual gives us a way to understand those situations better, to ask the right questions, and to demand accountability from those in power.
Exactly. It reminds us that even in the middle of all the chaos, there are rules, there are standards, and there are people who are actually trying to uphold those principles, even when it's hard. We can't lose sight of that.
No, we can't. Well, on that note, as we wrap up this deep dive, any final thoughts you want to leave our listeners with? Something to ponder as they continue to, learn more about this topic?
Hmm. Well, I think it comes back to that question we keep circling, about the tension between security and humane treatment. As you learn more about these issues, as you hear stories about people who have been affected by internment and resettlement, keep asking yourself, how can we as a society do a better job of navigating that tension? How can we make sure that our actions, both here at home and around the world, reflect our commitment to both security and compassion? How can we hold ourselves and our leaders accountable for upholding those values, even when it's really tough?
Those are some really important questions, ones that I know I'll be thinking about long after this deep dive is over. Thanks again for guiding us through this. It's been quite a journey.
My pleasure. And to all our listeners out there, thanks for joining us. Keep asking those tough questions, keep learning, and keep pushing for a world where security and humanity can truly coexist. It's a tough goal, but it's a goal worth fighting for.